Is this an area that I can differentiate in? And I think that's really important. If you're not first to market, you really need to be differentiated, or we would say best in class, right? And I know you're not going to know that very early, but if there are already some key parameters, and this is where having the scientists that really know the science and being able to say, hey, we think that this is a limitation of this particular mechanism, or this is a limitation of the lead product, and mechanistically, we really want to find out how we can differentiate here. Those would be really core nuggets of data that I think would be helpful.
This is the Nucleate Podcast, the voice of the next generation of biotech leaders.
In this episode of the Nucleate Podcast, we sit down with Kendra Rose, whose career bridges science, innovation, and business development across the pharmaceutical industry. Kendra holds a Ph.D. in chemistry from Stanford University and an MBA from the Wharton School, and has held leadership roles including senior scientist, director of innovation at Johnson & Johnson, global brand director at Novartis, and most recently, senior vice president of business development and licensing for cell and gene therapy in the cardiovascular and immunology space at Bayer. This episode features a thoughtful and wide-ranging conversation with Kendra on everything from women's health and cardiovascular disease to evaluating new technologies in pharma, and the importance of credible storytelling when working with investors and healthcare stakeholders. What made this discussion especially engaging was Kendra's ability to connect big picture industry trends with personal lessons from her own career journey, offering honest perspectives on resilience, mentorship, networking, and navigating different education and career pathways in science and business. It was fascinating to hear how relationship building, ecosystem engagement, and authentic communication continue to shape innovation across biotech and pharma. Whether you're interested in entrepreneurship, drug development, or building a career in the life sciences, there's a lot of practical insight packed into this episode. I took away a number of new perspectives from this conversation, and I hope you will too. All right, welcome and hello to the Nucleate Podcast, Kendra. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Yeah, you too. I guess just to start, it'd be really nice to get to know you in terms of how you got interested in science. Do you mind kind of talking about kind of like maybe your childhood a little bit and kind of what sparked that interest originally in science?
Sure. I guess I would say I was always interested in math. And so math to me was like all about solving problems, forging a path. And when I got to college, what I realized was that there was math in other areas of science. And so once I started taking more, advanced classes in chemistry and physics, and in particular chemistry, I realized like there was a creative side to science that went way beyond math. And that's what really got me engaged in a broader scientific arena than just exploring math. It was really that blend of the creativity and the problem solving. And I really have to acknowledge that I felt very fortunate to have professors that I was really able to build relationships that could really be role models, but also could be sounding boards to figure out what direction was most suited for me to head in as I thought about my career post undergrad.
Yeah, absolutely. I find professors to be kind of a invaluable source to kind of get wisdom, but also kind of really inspire, especially at an early age. I'd also like to kind of just follow up on that a little bit in terms of, I guess a lot of people these days, once they get their undergraduate degree, kind of struggle whether they should go to PhD or not. What was that kind of decision making for you and ultimately led to you getting a PhD?
I have to confess, I think times have changed a little bit. Certainly at the time, I felt like I really didn't have a great awareness of what potential jobs were out there. And I also really was interested in being a teacher. So between those two things, it seemed like a natural fit to try to get my PhD, explore a little bit more what the job opportunities were. And to me, it still was a viable path to pursue being a professor. But clearly, once I got to grad school, I realized that there were a lot more opportunities. It was just more difficult to really gauge that coming out of undergrad, which is why I decided, to really take that next step and get a little bit more education and allow myself to continue to explore the pathways.
And during your experience in your PhD, obviously you mentioned you were previously considering an academic kind of career in teaching. And you did end up making a pretty significant pivot from that to become a senior scientist at J&J after graduation. Can you take us a little bit through that thought process? I'm sure a lot of folks in our audience are currently in their PhDs or considering a PhD and toying with the idea of industry. So I'm curious, what were the factors that led you to move to industry?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the big things at the time was that I loved research, but what I didn't like was all of the grant writing. And, it really also depends on your personality. I have I'm much more of an extrovert than an introvert. And so I felt that I was a bit better suited to have a role that was maybe for me more outgoing and more active than reflective. And really understanding that about myself was important. I felt like I really learned that during my PhD process. And by the end, I knew I wanted to do something a little bit more applied versus being a professor that had to write grants to support all my research. And the irony of that was that in the good fortune is that many companies obviously come to campus to interview. And the reason I ended up at J&J was that was squarely in the sweet spot for me of this applicability, right? How do I find something that's very hands-on? And so I wasn't only a scientist at J&J, but it was in consumer products. So for me, it was really about engagement beyond just being in the lab. I was in the lab working on science that was translated to an end consumer. And that was highly motivating for me. And it was a great first job for me out of my PhD program.
Now, in terms of that role in the consumer-oriented view, that's different than obviously what you're doing now, more in the pharma space. I'm curious on what lessons you learned, obviously as a scientist too, like how J&J moves science forward in general, but I'm also curious about how that made you think through the consumer orientation, how that made you think through perhaps patient needs as you did move into the pharma world.
Yes. So it was actually, you hit the nail on the head with this question. For me, being in the consumer world, it really was it was fairly fast paced. The turnover in consumer products is quite quick. And so you're really able to pivot your product development in an appropriate way and in a quick fashion to get products that people want to the market. So I found that to be very, very engaging. And the big thing I learned was that as a scientist, you can really think that you have the answer or what you're doing is the right thing to do. But if there's no acceptance of this idea in the marketplace, it's not going to go anywhere. And so I think that was actually one of my core learnings. And as a scientist, you have to be willing to let some things go and be a little bit more open-minded that you may need to pivot. The other thing I would say is that sometimes there's innovation that is early. And at the time you might think, okay, I'm not sure that this is the best idea, or maybe you abandon it because you didn't have the right information, the right access to technology, or whatever it might be. But it's always worth keeping track of those innovations and those ideas because it just might have been a little early and it might be something that you can go back to. And that was something else I learned in my early days in consumer products, was that there just might have been things that were very well suited, but maybe a little bit too early innovation to be accepted in the marketplace. So it just required a little bit more keeping it on the radar, and then as technologies evolve, right, leveraging these new technologies to really bring that to life. So those were a couple of the core learnings that I embraced early on, and maybe then the pivot to pharma and the difference and how I leveraged that learning in consumer and in med device. By the way, I did a little stint in med device before I went to pharma. You're really designing and developing products that are very hands-on and for the consumer. And so it was very easy to collect that information and understand the needs. Pharma is a little bit different, right? Pharma is about the patient needs. You're sort of one level detached from the patient when you're actually developing drugs or whatever it might be. And very often you have an asset or a potential therapeutic, and you're not even sure where to use it yet. And so it's almost like flipped the whole consumer thing on its head. And that was an adjustment for me pretty early on was, how do you think about the consumer or the patient needs so early in the process when you don't even know yet what the drug can really do? And then couple that with, and this is where I think the problem solving, the strategic thinking really comes into play. You have to make some pretty big investment decisions fairly early on. So really sifting through what the options are, how do you invest in those no regret moves is very, very important in pharma. There are some really important strategic decisions that will not only put you down a path, but also require a significant amount of money, probably more so than being in consumer and device at the time. And that also has been what I would say is intellectually stimulating as we think about the path forward in pharma.
I'll touch on one thing you mentioned a little bit midway through, which is that some of the innovations might just not be ready for prime time, but they may come about later. And I think a good example of that is radiopharmaceuticals. I know that those have been around for decades in terms of the concept of them, but I think there may have been just some specific technologies, linkers, radioisotopes, et cetera, that just weren't ready yet to get those to be ready yet. And another similar example is antibody drug conjugates. I think those also have been around conceptually for quite a long time. So similar idea, you just need to be ready for those when they're out. And similar story with biospecifics, all very hot areas today, but I think they've been around for quite a while. To your last point, I think it's really interesting that your consumer mindset ultimately does help you think about the patient perspective, but it's very challenging to know what that is when a drug can be used in a bunch of different patient populations. So I'm curious, when you're thinking through, like you're saying, those no regret decisions, what helps you make that? Like, what information do you need to collect as an executive to say, you're very confident in this? And for the entrepreneurs in our audience who are working on a more nimble company, they're able to pivot more easily. But I'm curious on, too, if there's any perhaps lessons that would apply more universally when you're making those big no regret decisions with, not the full information set in front of you, right? Like, you don't know how each path will play out. You have incomplete, imperfect information to make those decisions. So I'm curious on how you think about those.
Yeah, I guess I would say in a couple of ways. One is, what is that usually it is around data of some kind, right? What is the data that could support potentially multiple patient populations or would be able to support going into various different pathways? So that's one important parameter. I would say the second one is, what is that, if there is one? There's not always one, it might be multiple, but what are those one or two things that would really enable future decision making, right? Because if you have certain data and we absolutely, whether it's some sort of, animal data, whether it's safety level data, something that you might know either about that mechanism that you would have to show as a potential differentiator, or some sort of reason to believe that this would really truly make a difference for this asset moving forward. So it's usually one of those two things, or sometimes both.
I would love to dig deeper into, what do you think is maybe a key kind of piece of data that you look for to make those future decisions?
In what regard? Like a key piece of data? So, it just depends what stage you're at, right? In terms of your drug development. If you're extremely early, then sometimes you actually, maybe this sounds a little counterintuitive, but sometimes you might even just need to get a little market data to really understand, like, is there really a market there? Because we're going to potentially make some moves now to move this asset forward into this direction, but we're not totally sure there's a market. And this is particularly true in some of these rarer diseases where, I think we really want to be guided by unmet needs. And there's so many diseases with high unmet needs, but especially as you're potentially a small company moving forward, you have to make sure that you're working in a space that not only are there unmet needs, but there can also be a mechanism to actually tap into the market down the road. Right. And so you need, and you need to sell your story, because that's how you're going to get investors. And so sometimes it's just understanding, is there a market? Are there interests of others, investors, et cetera, in this particular category? And is this an area that I can differentiate in? And I think that's really important. If you're not first to market, you really need to be differentiated, or we would say best in class, right? And I know you're not going to know that very early, but if there are already some key parameters, and this is where having the scientists that really know the science, and being able to say, hey, we think that this is a limitation of this particular mechanism, or this is a limitation of the lead product, and mechanistically, we really want to find out how we can differentiate here. Those would be really core nuggets of data that I think would be helpful. But it really depends where you're at in your decision making. What kind of investment do you already have? Who's behind you? What do you already know? So there are a lot of different elements that would go into determining what that key piece of information that you might want to invest in would help you move forward.
Yeah, that's great. Definitely having the good science, but also doing the due diligence and some landscape analysis sounds like it's definitely in your interest early on in preclinical. Great stuff. Thank you.
So you've highlighted a lot of the considerations that go into how you make decisions as a BD executive now. I'm curious, going back in time a bit, you started out as a scientist, as we were talking about, and then you had to make that shift. And it's obviously, as you're highlighting all these different considerations you now make, having that scientific acumen is a key cornerstone of your business development capabilities, because you know what questions to ask to evaluate a lot of these new drugs that are coming in. But I am curious, when you did make the leap from the scientist role, and you mentioned consumer products, to business development and pharma-oriented, what was the biggest challenge going from a scientific-oriented role to a business role? I think a lot of folks in our audience perhaps are training in their PhDs or in their postdocs, and they're pivoting into the business world, and they don't even know where to start. So I'm curious on what skills were most important for you to learn and how you approach that.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually interesting to look back, because what I realize is this was also a gradual process, right? And you learn along the way. So happy to share those learnings for others. I guess I would say working in consumer products and then med devices, we already talked about. What I was compelled by was being at this intersection between the science and the market, if you will. And I really felt over time, one of the things that started evolving and emerging for me was this: somebody has to help translate the science to something that is easy to understand in the marketplace, right? Whether it's a patient or whether it's a investor or, someone else, it's not always scientist to scientist. And so figuring out and being at that interface of how to translate the science into easy language is really, really important. How do you explain how this works, right? I mean, how many times have people spent time on an MOA, and the whole point was to distill it down so people could really understand why it works and why it's different. So that was actually something that I felt like I started learning in those other roles that really helped me pivot. And I would say for these early entrepreneurs who are often, founding scientists, that's a really good lesson, because knowing the audience and figuring out how to distill the message for that audience is very, very important. I mean, there are times that I can be talking to someone in the sciences, and you know that they're brilliant and they really know the science. But I also recognize that I'm probably not picking up every single thing that they're saying because they do get very entrenched in the science. So figuring out how to make that message and get that message across is extremely, extremely important. And I guess another thing I touched on was knowing the audience, right? Who are you talking to? Because sometimes that science is absolutely, talking at a very, very scientific level is needed, right? Going to key conferences and conveying your data and, why you believe it is. But there are other times when you don't either have the time to get that deep into the science, or you're speaking with people that maybe aren't that deep into the science. And that, I think, is very, very important. And a lesson that someone, or maybe a tip that someone gave me at one point in time, is don't always feel compelled to give all the information. People want to convey what they know. When they get asked a question, it's okay to not convey everything. Convey what you think are the key points, because then people can ask more. And it's a way to engage versus just tell. And I think that's something very important I've learned in my business career as well, is sometimes that pause, not saying everything, listening, making space for Q&A and engagement is really important. And it gives you even more credibility down the road than if you actually said everything that you wanted to say in the first place.
I think that's great. And it's a theme that we've heard before about storytelling being absolutely critical. So like you said, doing research. So in the case of someone talking to you at Bayer, making sure that they do research on what's new at Bayer, what's the recent investor presentations, R&D day presentations. So you are up to date on what the other party knows, and making sure that you're tailoring your pitch or conversation to the degree that you know the other party. And I think too, to the point on storytelling and business world versus the scientific world, typically a scientific presentation goes through a logical series of points. Like, here is my data, here's how it worked, here's the experimental conditions, and therefore here's my conclusion, which is a normal storytelling style. But I know in business, they want to know the answer up front. They want an executive summary. They want you to tell it to them first, tell them how you got there, and then tell them again at the end. So that's a difference in style that I think, people want to know in the first 60 seconds, what is the point of this conversation and what did you come up with and how does it work?
Yeah, that's very true. And I think also figuring out who to pull in when and for what, right? It's not about any one individual, right? I really enjoy the interactions. For example, the scientists at Bayer, I think, are stellar and top notch. And it's figuring out, how do we learn together, and when do I pull them in to tell the story, right? Versus when am I the storyteller, or when do I pull them in to assess more of, potential opportunities or other functional, counterparts. So, it's not always just about me and my business acumen, but how do I work across the spectrum and really figure out how to dig deeper in places with the right people at the right time.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, in terms of kind of talking across the spectrum, when you're balancing talking science and then going and talking more on the business side of things, was there anything coming from a scientist background that you kind of had to unlearn or relearn for the business side of communication?
Yeah, it probably, as I sort of alluded to earlier, I think it's at times being crisp, right? Just what are those core points? And maybe, especially as you think about, often now we are using slides to present a topic, or, to get everybody on the same page. So you have the visual and the verbal. When you have a slide, be prepared and know that what are like the couple of points that you really want to make, because you don't need to read everything off the slide. And you certainly don't, there are points on there that are probably valid and people can pick up on in the reading. But what is it that you verbally want to convey, and making sure that those points come through. And that's oftentimes easier to say than to do. And so just being crystal clear about what it is you want to accomplish with this particular audience and distilling it down to those key points that you want to get across is extremely important.
That's really helpful advice. Now, I want to talk more about what you're doing now in your role at Bayer, which we've mentioned a couple of times. So, you're Senior Vice President for Business Development, and your focus areas include cell and gene therapy, cardiovascular disease, and immunology disease at Bayer, which is a broad remit and sounds super interesting. So, I'm curious if you can tell our audience, who may not be very familiar with Bayer, about the company a little bit more and what your focus is in your role.
Sure. So the way I describe it is I work on everything that's not oncology or radiology. And for us, it's quite broad. It really depends upon the stage of the assets. So if you look at so we have a global footprint. If you look at the disease areas that we're playing in today, we're really leaders in women's health. And we're on the verge and we are launching in the US right now, a menopause drug. We are leaders outside the US, the rest of the world, with EYLEA in ophthalmology. So we're always interested in opportunities both in women's health and ophthalmology. But when you look at where do we play across the spectrum, meaning from very early research and having extensive research capabilities through to inline products. The core for us, aside from oncology, as I just mentioned, in my remit would be cardiovascular. And when we talk about cardiovascular, it's actually somewhat broad in the sense, the way I describe it, it's cardio, it's vascular, and it's renal. And you would see that our products span that space, right? We have an asset in the market today called Kerendia. It was first indicated in chronic kidney disease with type 2 diabetes. We since got the heart failure with preserved ejection fraction indication. So there's cardio, there's renal. And then more recently, we were very excited that the asundexian secondary stroke prevention trial read out positively. And so we'll be looking forward to that launching. Obviously, we had Xarelto in a similar space when it comes to the whole anticoagulation space. So that's what I meant by vascular. So we really do have what I would say is a broad spectrum of opportunities that we're looking for. And in those areas, we really are open to stage of assets because we do have an extensive pipeline and we also have capabilities to bring assets in irrespective of where it is in research and development.
One thing I'd want to dig in a little bit with you, and that's really helpful context. My take is that you are willing to go into areas that perhaps maybe aren't as sexy as some of the other therapeutic areas that a lot of venture capitalists are focused on. So when I talk to VCs, I'm often hearing these three: oncology, autoimmune disease, and neuro. And those are all important areas, no doubt. But what I'm noticing, my personal view is I think cardiovascular, respiratory, kidney disease, very underinvested areas, huge need there for, obviously these are the diseases that affect, these are population health-wide diseases. And I think the other one that's an obvious one to say that's underinvested in is women's health. I don't hear many large pharmas saying that they're willing to go into that space. And there's a lot of unmet need, and it's not just bikini medicine as it's called, right? It's not just about endometriosis. Women's health can be very broadly defined into other of these categories that you cover, like autoimmune disease and cardiovascular, because women classically with heart attacks, having been a physician by background, classically a heart attack is you have chest pain on your left side that radiates to your arm. That's a classic heart attack. For women, they come in with stomach pain. So for trained physicians, we know that's something to consider with women, that they have different symptoms than men. But broadly speaking, the point I'm driving at is, it seems like within your remit, Kendra, that you are including some areas that are affecting broad population health, but perhaps are getting underinvested in. So I'm curious on what trends you're finding most compelling and interesting in whichever ones you want to cover. There's a lot to work with here, but I'm curious on what trends you're finding interesting in these spaces.
So I would actually, if I start with women's health, what I would say is that there really has been a lack of investment overall in the space for several years. Even on our end, we were seeing just this lack of innovation. And we really have been trying to focus more than on, where we're at, can we find clinical stage assets now, et cetera. What I am seeing as a key trend, and I think it's because there has been so much work done by several companies to highlight the unmet needs, as you said, not just saying that cardiovascular death is still the number one reason for women die, which I think is a misnomer. It just shows you how much work has been done in the area of breast cancer, because most women would say it's breast cancer. So I think first and foremost, continuing to, what we're seeing now is maybe more holistic efforts to educate on where women are and what women's needs are. And as you said, it's not just about what was traditionally called women's health. It's what are the areas that are overrepresented by women, which includes autoimmune disease. So what we're seeing now is more research being done to really understand these areas, more education happening to highlight across the spectrum, like where, women are underrepresented, especially in many clinical trials. And then thirdly, that's resonating with investors. And what we're seeing now is a lot more investor activity in the women's health space. And so I view that as a real leading indicator that we're going to start seeing some additional innovation in the women's health area. We're going to see more women represented in clinical trials, et cetera. It's not, it's a little bit easier said than done. But I'm really happy to see that trend coming to fruition. I would also say that Bayer has a legacy in many of these disease areas, like cardiovascular. It's not an easy disease area, partially because much of the translation is not straightforward, meaning you might see trends in a phase 2 trial, but you could end up investing a lot of money into a phase 3 trial that's not positive. Right. So there's still high risk when you go from a phase 2 to a phase 3 outcome study. So we want to stay in those areas because we have legacy. We have expertise that we think really differentiates our company. But what we're also trying to do is figure out new ways to help manage that risk. Right. We call it, how do we do better, more precise drug development? Whether that's using platform plays, whether that's figuring out how do we actually, what biomarkers might we employ, how do we select patients. There are so many technologies that are emerging out there now that really help us think about this phrase that I recall we used many, many years ago, which is, how do you employ the right drug for the right patient at the right time? And this is also really interesting. Sometimes saying it 15 years ago, we all strove to do it. But now I think that there's more technologies out there that can enable us to do that. So we're also very much looking and investing in, technologies that we think can help drive some of those areas. And so I see that as another trend. You see it across many companies saying, okay, they do want to do more precise drug development and leverage these tools and technologies. Maybe the last point I would make is, you said, well, we're not classically in some of these other areas, but we are dabbling in neuro, and in immunology already. And I guess what I would highlight is because of innovation. So we did make some acquisitions of platform companies, around the 2019 through 2021 timeframe. And that included Vividian, which does chemoproteomics, really trying to drug the undruggable. And they have oncology and immunology assets. So we are looking at the immunology space via them to start. It is Blue Rock in cell therapy, and it is AskBio in gene therapy. And I think that and they're in neurology as well as some of the other disease areas. So we do have that neuro those neural programs in Parkinson's disease in particular. And interestingly, I think in that time frame, there was really cell and gene therapy was hot. And then I think it cooled off a little bit, probably the last couple of years. And what we're seeing now is, I think there were a lot of companies out there in the cell and gene therapy space. And it seems like there's been a bit of culling through some of the technology. And what I predict now is that we'll see more advances. It just took a little bit of time for us to get there. There was a plethora of opportunities. It's kind of slimmed down. But now I think what we'll start seeing is not only because of the time, but also the technology that remains, more successes in the cell and gene therapy space. So that's a space to watch as well.
Yeah, you raised some excellent points, especially just going back to cardiology, cardiovascular disease, going back to how even there is like AF mouse models, and scientists can cure AF in a mouse. It doesn't always translate so well when it goes to phase 1 or phase 2. And it definitely shows the need for more precision. I'm wondering, in someone in your position, how do you evaluate those technologies? As you said, they're becoming much more abundant in the field.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I guess the short answer is it's not easy. Some of it has to be trial and error, right? But this is also where engaging with the scientists in our organization is really important. And the scientists are not just what I would say are traditional researchers or people in development, but it also includes the data scientists. Like, we actually have a host of people in our organization that are working on some of these digital data science technologies. And so it really is bringing them together with our, more traditional researchers to do some assessment. And some of it's, you have to pick your bets, right? And some of it is like figuring out how, and this is where the art of the deal comes into play. Maybe it's doing a small collaboration first, right? Hey, let's work together and do a little bit of research together between the platform and our research scientists. Typically it's a platform, right? Most of these plays are considered platforms, to consider what would be, not only what would we deem successful that would give us confidence to take the next step, but in what areas. And finding that sweet spot together is often, the first step. And we might do that across a couple of different platforms and companies so that you're not all in. And I think it's also hard to find one thing that is suitable for everything, right? So you're going to need multiple plays anyways. So looking a little bit broadly, but trying to figure out what are the couple of things that we think seem to convey or be suited to what we're looking for, and then taking some small risks with a few different organizations that we think could actually give us enough proof of concept to potentially engage more broadly.
That's really helpful. And, we were on the topic of platform companies. What would you say an entrepreneur that you're talking to would be well suited to do to advance a conversation with you? There's a lot of folks in our audience who have broad platforms. They may be proceeding with one asset while still continuing to develop their platform, and they may not know how to best position themselves effectively. So I'm curious, what do the best entrepreneurs that you work with do? What is it about them, the way they present themselves, the way they interact, the storytelling element, and how do they, what level of data do they need to be interesting to you guys? And I'm curious if that's a good jumping off point to cover how the Bayer ecosystem works, including the Co.Lab, which we had a whole separate podcast about in the past.
So I would say, your point about storytelling is an important one. But I would add the word credible storytelling, because obviously many of these early companies, there's still a lot of unknowns, and we fully acknowledge that. So it's sort of conveying what is known, and what you know about the science. It is great if there is a lead program that you can really use as a way to demonstrate how the platform technology works and what you've learned about the platform technology. But I guess for me, it's this credibility piece. So oftentimes someone will come and they really want to sell, but sometimes it's overselling, right? Oh, our platform can do everything, right? So I think that's the understanding the technology and being very focused on what it can do and bringing solid. Doesn't have to be, obviously, you're not going to have oftentimes solid proof of concept yet, right? You might be pre-proof of concept. You might not be in the clinic. But what is it that you can convey about the science and what you've learned? Because sometimes it's the what you tried and failed that helped you figure out what to do with the platform. And being willing to share some of that as insights gained is really important. So it's not just we think our platform can do all of this. It's really being like we believe our platform has various capabilities, but we actually want to tell you about a few things and why we think the way we think. And if there is a lead program, leveraging that, but also leveraging the things that didn't work or how you learned about the platform is extremely important. It adds this level of credibility and it starts to build trust and engagement around the science that is also extremely important when you're having those initial conversations. So maybe then just transitioning, you asked about our ecosystem. How do we engage then? If somebody wants to tell us the story, how do we engage? And I think we do that in several ways. You brought up the Co.Labs. The Co.Labs are really our incubator. We had one in Berlin that was going for many years, and we recently relaunched that one. It's actually a year old now, just this month. And we have other Co.Lab facilities in Boston, Cambridge, and in Japan and China as well. And really wanting to tap into what are those innovation hubs across the globe. And so the way that we work within that ecosystem is we actually have individuals that not only run the Co.Labs, but we also have, broader teams within those ecosystems that are really developing those relationships, working with local VCs, working with, other groups. Nucleate's an example, right? Having a relationship with Nucleate to understand maybe are there some very early stage companies that might be suited for, for the Co.Labs. I think working with those types of organizations is also important. So I would say we tap into this ecosystem broadly, with across the globe, but then with various functions. And so the way that we interact is via our scientists, right? So we might do an R&D day with our Co.Labs so that they can actually learn more about the Co.Lab residents and the Co.Lab technology. We do various events at the Co.Labs. We did as an example, we did an RNA panel in early November, which was great to get the companies that are interested in the space together and have these broader conversations with folks who have some experience and have already shown some success in the RNA area. So we do it in a very variety of ways. And when we look for companies, not only do we look locally, but we engage a broader base of individuals to help assess what technologies we think are not only cutting edge innovation, but could be of interest to us down the road. And so when we do this assessment, we pull in our researchers, we pull in people from business development, we pull people from our platform companies to really engage in that initial discussion about what companies would be most suited for our Co.Labs. And then, of course, we are always looking for various technologies, whether it's at partnering meetings like Bio. Bio has a lot of very early stage companies, and we attend various Bio meetings. Not only we have the main Bio meeting, Bio International in summertime, but we have Bio Europe, we have Bio Spring, there's Bio China. So I think those are offer real opportunities for us to engage in a broader with a broader set of companies as well. So we view our whole organization as drug hunters, not just the BD team. And we do really pride ourselves on having a very collaborative effort when it comes to thinking about these technologies and what might be most interesting for Bayer.
Yeah, I'm interested more in terms of, it seems like Bayer has definitely been successful at kind of creating and generating these biohubs in a globalized way. Is there anything in your mind that you think makes one of these hubs successful? And like, how do you and Bayer go about kind of searching for like emerging biohubs per se?
Want to look for various technologies. Your question about how do you identify that cutting edge technology? I think, again, it goes back to it's really all about the interaction and who we pull in to have that discussion. It has to be a cross-functional effort on our end to really be able to assess what do we think is going to be that next big thing, or how do we view that innovation. And by the way, it might not be, I think there are multiple next big things. It's actually identifying the next big thing that we think is suitable for us, right? And that's where having the engagement with the broader Bayer community is extremely important. And so, as I said, we do that with having our R&D scientists engaged, but we also try to work closely with the folks that we have in our co-labs to help them develop, right? If they have questions, like what would pharma be interested in? If we have this technology and we want to move it forward, what are your recommendations? How might you think about this? So we do try to do a bit of mentoring with those co-lab companies. And then we have broader outreach where we have some virtual programs going on, as well as virtual mentoring with some of these early stage companies as well. They don't just have to sit in the co-labs themselves.
That's great. That the Co.Lab provides such hands-on mentorship, and sounds like a very appealing program for a startup that wants to engage with pharma, wants to advance their science as much as they can. And I think you raised this point early. Getting market feedback early on in your journey as a startup is useful to know. And I think it actually, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, in the case of a startup, it's like, yes, your ultimate end goal is a patient. But in between that is a pharma, honestly, a lot of times, because they're going to have the capacity to actually commercialize a drug. So understanding what patients need and how your drug what your platform will generate is actually beneficial to patients. Sometimes hard, to your point, but knowing within a broad category of autoimmune disease, what are the needs and how could your drug fit into that for patients, but also understanding from a pharma perspective. And I think we talked about this at the beginning, the differentiation story. What is unique about your drug? What problem does it solve that other drugs do not solve? I understand that to be a critical item. So I'm assuming before you get into the co-lab, even having that story really nailed down is helpful. And I'm sure it can be refined with the mentorship that you provide.
Yes. I also think that, understanding what your business model is important, right? Because sometimes you have technologies that, okay, are we going to generate assets out of this platform? Are we going to be a technology? Do we want to do fee for service? And having some concrete thoughts about that is critically important, because if we want to do a deal, it's hard if you actually don't know your business model.
I'm assuming part of that is also just picking a lane. There might not always be a correct answer. There might be multiple correct answers, right? If you have a platform that can generate a lot of drugs, I guess Alnylam is perhaps a good example of this. They had siRNA technology. I think they started out with several partnerships, and I think they were deciding, do we just keep going down this route of designing early drugs and then partnering them out, or are we going to develop some of them on our own? So that can be part of the strategy too, like early on, do some partnering to get validation and then develop our own drugs. There's multiple ways to skin that cat. But I think, to your point, having a perspective, even if every option is on the table, is going to be helpful for the parties on the other side, if you know.
Otherwise, it's very, very difficult for us to engage in a meaningful way, right? There are other things out there then. If you can't find a path that's easy to pursue out the gate, then it can just stagnate, which would be unfortunate if it's good technology.
And I imagine too, if someone came into you and said, like, look, we're planning on being a platform company. We want to, develop a bunch of drugs to an early stage and then partner them out. I'm assuming you can work with them in that model, but then perhaps while working with them, you can say, look, like, I think you're going to need to take this further along than you perhaps initially thought. So I'm assuming it's an iterative process anyway, but at least picking a lane to start is going to be useful.
Yes. Yeah. Agreed.
That's great. So pivoting a bit to talk about advice for the folks in our audience. As a scientist yourself, if you could give one piece of advice to a scientist who's early in their career and they're looking to potentially move into industry, and to move into broader strategic roles, what advice would you have for them?
Probably a couple things. I think the network, it's an obvious answer, but the network is extremely important. And continuing to build the network, your network, is really, it's what's going to help you go places, right? And I think those of us, especially scientists, who are typically very hard workers, and we've had to do a lot to get where we are, we often have this attitude that, grit and hard work will get us places, which it does. But at the end of the day, having the network will get you places better, more quickly, right? Because you can tap into the right people to help you, get to where you want to go. So I think that building that network and making time for it. I think earlier in my career, I didn't network enough because I felt like I was selling myself too much. Right? What do they want with me? Why would they network with me? Right? And I think, really learning how to tell your story, to network with individuals, because it is important. And believe it or not, I mean, people do want to network. You don't have to come into it and think, okay, well, am I only getting something out of this? What am I giving? If I can't give this person something, then maybe that they don't want to talk to me. That's totally not true. Most people, you have to start somewhere. Most people want to pay it forward in some way. And so, and also you're building your network with individuals, but those individuals are also building their network. And the one thing I have found is pharma in particular and biotech, it's a small world, actually. I mean, people go places, different companies, people move all the time. Your network will continue to expand just by people moving to other companies. And so you never know what's going to happen, where people are going to go, how it's going to impact your network more broadly. So I would just say the number one thing is do not be afraid to network and continue to build your network. I guess the second thing is if you really feel like you're pivoting more from science to business, is probably finding a few people that can truly be mentors would be useful. Like true mentors. It's really hard actually to find true mentors, but they sort of, many times they emerge. Who are those one or two people that you can really talk to and share, where you're at, get advice. Oftentimes those relationships evolve over time. And it can start as thinking you're just building your network, but then they really become a mentor. And so being open-minded about that, like I need a mentor, and it's good to have mentors because you might also have to be a little vulnerable with those mentors to get the right feedback. But that's critically important as well, because I'm sure that mentors, if they're good mentors, they see things that you don't see, right? And they really should be able to provide you that very meaningful feedback. So those are a couple critical points. It's, you can get into skill building and how do you do those things, but I think everybody recognizes that you want to continue to build your skills, and that's probably an easier thing to identify. It's these other intangibles around the network and the mentorship that's a little bit trickier.
That's excellent advice. And I want to emphasize something that you said within the networking piece is that it's about individuals. Because I think a lot of folks in our audience, when they hear the word networking, they perhaps imagine a larger auditorium at their university, name tags, milling around, not knowing who to talk to, and or just like a LinkedIn feed full of people self-congratulating and things like that. Like, I'm humbled to announce XYZ, right? And I think a lot of people cringe at that sometimes, or they're nervous about being in those big rooms. But I would say, to your point about individuals, you can go to smaller events. And like you said, biotech is a small world. And you already mentioned the Boston ecosystem is quite small. Going to these smaller, more intimate events and actually having personal conversations with people is what it's about. It's not about, well, not always anyway, about having the name tag and milling around a big room with 1,000 people.
Or giving someone your card.
Exactly. It can
Or
also
your
be
LinkedIn.
Exactly. It can also be a lot of times one-on-one conversations where you happen to be in, let's say, Kendall Square, for example, and you come across someone who's in the industry and you just have a conversation with them as you're getting your coffee. That is also networking. And to your point, you might find some of those who may end up becoming your mentors. And I'll say too about LinkedIn, finding people who you admire, who are inspiring to you and saying, hey, like, I admire your path and it's something that I would love to do someday too. The value that you're providing to them is the ability to pay it forward to the next generation of leaders. So if you say like, hey, actually do your research, say hypothetically they're reaching out to you, hi Kendra, I noticed you're in this role at Bayer and you did this deal and I'm also a scientist like you were. I'd love to chat. I'm assuming that's going to go over much better than more of a generic message. And I'm sure you have your own mentees that you work with as well. But point being that it's about individual one-on-one connections at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Genuine connections, right? For sure.
Absolutely.
I kind of want to move into a more general question or advice for maybe early scientists or maybe students who are just graduating. I feel like a lot of students, at least from the feedback that I've been getting, is that students looking to get into pharma eventually feel like they're compelled to get a PhD or an MBA first. Oftentimes what they learn is not always super compatible in a PhD or is at least attractive to pharma companies. So I'm wondering what your take is in terms of getting a PhD or an MBA as kind of a prerequisite for entry into pharma.
Well, I guess it depends, right? It really depends what you want to do and where your passion lies. If you are someone who, as an example, right? We have lots of benchtop chemists, right? If you know you want to be a benchtop chemist, then be a benchtop chemist, and you don't necessarily need a PhD for that, right? And you might decide later that, okay, I want to go do something else, and then I need to go back to school. And by the way, pharma actually does usually provide funds for education. So it really is, to me, it's not, you don't have to have every step of the path mapped out. And you don't, even though you look at my background, you can see that I pretty quickly went to school and did got multiple degrees. But even though you can look at that and say, I just went and got my PhD, and then I pretty much went like 2 years later and got my MBA. You don't have to do that, right? And I didn't do that because I thought, oh, I need to go get all these degrees right away. I did it because I learned that I wanted to go more into business. And at that moment, I felt like the best path for me was to get my MBA. But I've seen it the other way around, right? People have gone, they've gotten jobs, they've done R&D for a while, and then they've decided to make the pivot. And they do it in various ways. They can do it through, a short-term assignment in an organization, right? You could also decide, I'm just going to go back to school. I'll keep my job, but the company can help support, and I will go back to school, which is harder because you have to make sacrifices in your personal life to do both at the same time. Or you could just full blown go back to school and really make the true, pivot by leaving your job, leaving the company, and just going back and getting the education and figuring out what you're going to do afterwards. So I really think it depends what motivates you, and what it is you feel like you really want to do when you first get out of school. Because looking back, you could get a master's. You don't, the PhD program is a long program. And you could argue at times that, maybe the time is better spent for some individuals doing more hands-on work, building more skills, really figuring out what you want to do. Not everyone needs to go get a PhD.
That's really helpful advice. So as we get here to the end, we're going to do a quick fire round. Alex and I are going to alternate questions with you and just say what first comes to your mind. And I'll give it a shot first. Are you an early bird or night owl?
I am an early bird because most of my team is in Europe, but I'm really, truly a night owl.
Completely fair.
All right. What's your favorite way to unplug after a long day?
I have to say, after a long day, it's probably like spending time with my family because they keep things real.
They always do, and humble, right? Keep you humble.
And humble, exactly. The real world problems.
That's right. If you weren't in biotech, what career would you be in?
That's a really
And healthcare is a cop-out.
No, I wasn't going to say that, actually. I think early on in my career, I was very much I loved in the science arena still, but like doing something more along the lines of like sports physiology. I really enjoyed like how the human body works. So doing something in that field and continuing to push that field forward, I think would have been really fun as well.
Nice. Yeah. Now going back to your current position, what's one leadership trait you value above all else?
To me, it's empowering others. People want to feel like they have control over what they do and can help drive, the projects, drive decision making. And so giving that freedom and treating people like you would want to be treated, to me, is the most important skill to bring to the table.
Excellent. And what's something most people don't know about you? That may be a harder one.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Do I want to say what most people don't know about me?
It could be an interesting hobby or place you've been to.
Yeah, I would say that I said this the other day, and people were very surprised that I pretty much watch sports and news.
Okay.
I don't watch much TV, but I love sports. Maybe it's the competitive nature of it, but I love it. So,
what's your go-to sport that you're following most closely?
Probably soccer these days because I have a lot of soccer players in my household.
Okay. Very cool.
So every Saturday and Sunday, it's on the TV. MLS, but also, Premier League. I mean, there's something always on to watch in terms of soccer.
Love that. And last thing is, any final advice for the founders or young scientists in our audience?
Yeah, I think there's still so much innovation out there. And so sometimes there will be, there'll be frustrations, right? There may be times where you feel like, did I do the right thing? Or, I'm not sure that I'm cut out for this, but I think it's really like continuing, if that's where you started and you're following your heart, continuing to follow that, because there is still so much space for innovation and there's so much opportunity. Going back to this whole unmet needs, there's still so many unmet needs out there that can be fulfilled. So just keeping that passion, I think, is really important when you get into those tough times.
Excellent. That's fantastic advice. Well, on that note, Kendra, thank you so much for joining the Nucleate podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to the Nucleate podcast. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with future episodes. See you next time.